A police officer saves a young black girl during a deadly raid, risking his life and losing everything in the process. Branded a traitor, abandoned by his own, he fades into silence while the girl vanishes from his world. But 18 years later, their paths cross again in the most powerful courtroom in the city, because the girl he saved is now a federal judge. And when she sees him walk in, she stops the trial and does something no one in that room will ever forget. How does she repay the man who sacrificed it all? And what secret has she carried with her all these years? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Rain drummed steadily against the dark streets of Redgate, creating silver rivers in the gutters that reflected the glow of streetlights. A police squad car pulled up silently outside a modest brick building, its headlights cutting through the misty evening before going dark. The community center's warm yellow windows stood out like beacons against the gloomy weather, showing glimpses of life inside. Mark Harlan sat in the passenger seat, his experienced eyes scanning the scene. Through the windows, he could see children gathered around tables. Some bent over coloring books while others listened attentively to a story being read at the front of the room. The sight made something twist in his gut. This didn't feel right. The radio crackled. All units in position. Confirmed intel on violent gang activity. Proceed with extreme caution. Weapons are expected on site. Carl Denver's voice came through next, sharp and authoritative. Copy that. Remember, this is a known safe house. We go in hard and fast. No chances. Mark watched another child laugh at something in their book. His hand went to his radio. Control, can we confirm that intel again? I'm seeing a lot of civilians, mostly children. Stick to the plan, Harlan. Denver's cut in, his voice carrying an edge that Mark knew all too well. We've got solid information. Don't go soft now. More squad cars pulled up, their lights off. Officers in tactical gear began to assemble, checking weapons and adjusting body armor. Mark's shoulder ached from an old injury as he got out of the car, the rain immediately soaking into his uniform. He watched Denver stride through the gathering force, giving last-minute instructions with the confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times before. Remember, these gangs use kids as cover, Denver's was saying. Don't let your guard down just because you see some finger painting. The tactical team moved into position. Mark's training kicked in automatically, but he couldn't shake the wrongness of it all. Through the windows, he could see a young woman at the front of the room, animated as she read from a picture book. The children sat cross-legged on the floor around her, completely absorbed in the story. The radio crackled one final time. All units, go, go, go. The front door crashed open under the force of a battering ram. Screams erupted from inside as officers poured in, weapons raised, shouting commands that mixed with the sounds of terror and confusion. Tables overturned. Papers and crayons scattered across the floor like confetti. Everyone on the ground, hands where we can see them. Mark moved in with the others, but his steps slowed as he took in the scene. There were no weapons, no gang members, no drugs, just scattered art supplies, toppled bookshelves, and terrified faces. A volunteer tried to shield her group of children, tears streaming down her face as an officer zip-tied her hands behind her back. Please, she begged. They're just kids. This is a reading program. Denver's pushed past Mark, his weapon sweeping the room. Secure every corner. Check under the tables. Mark's throat tightened as he watched a young boy being separated from his mother. Carl, he called out. Something's not right here. These are just... A sudden movement under one of the few remaining upright tables caught Denver's attention. His weapon snapped up instantly, finger tightening on the trigger. Movement. Suspect under the table. Mark saw it too. Small fingers gripping the table's edge, a shadow shifting in the space beneath. But what Denver saw as a threat, Mark recognized as fear. Wait! Mark shouted, but Denver's was already stepping forward, his stance aggressive. A small face peeked out from under the table, a little girl, no more than 8 years old, a blue crayon clutched in her trembling hand. Her eyes went wide with terror as she found herself staring down the barrel of Denver's gun. Time seemed to slow. Mark saw Denver's finger squeeze the trigger. Without thinking, he lunged forward, throwing himself between the gun and the child. The sound of the shot was deafening in the enclosed space. White-hot pain exploded in Mark's shoulder as the bullet tore through him. He crashed to the floor, his vision blurring. The little girl's scream pierced through everything else, high, terrified, and raw. Chaos erupted anew. Officers shouted in confusion. Someone called for medical support. Mark felt hands grabbing him, dragging him backward across the floor. Through the haze of pain, he could see the girl being pulled out from under the table by another officer, her face streaked with tears, the blue crayon still clutched in her shaking hand. Denver's voice cut through the mayhem, already spinning the story. Officer down. Suspect caused friendly fire incident during raid. Get him out of here. Mark tried to speak, to protest, but the pain made it impossible to form words. As they pulled him toward the door, he caught one last glimpse of Denver's speaking into his radio, his voice cool and controlled. Control, we have an officer down. Harland interfered with the operation, caused a discharge. Send medical support. Denver's paused, looking down at Mark with cold eyes. He blew the op. Rain fell on Mark's face as they dragged him outside, mixing with the sweat of pain. The last thing he saw before his vision faded was the community center's sign, still cheerfully advertising. After-school reading program. Everyone welcome. In that moment, lying on the wet pavement with his shoulder burning and his career ending, Mark understood with perfect clarity that he had just become the scapegoat for something much darker than he'd ever imagined. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital room slowly came into focus as Mark's eyes fluttered open. His shoulder throbbed with a deep, persistent ache that seemed to pulse in time with the steady beeping of the heart monitor. As his consciousness sharpened, he became aware of the cold metal handcuffs securing his right wrist to the bed rail. A man in a crisp suit stood by the window, his back turned to Mark as he spoke quietly into a phone. The badge clipped to his belt identified him as Internal Affairs. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the sterile room. Ah, Officer Harland, finally awake. The IA investigator turned, tucking his phone away. His face was stern, almost carved from stone. I'm Detective Matthews from Internal Affairs. We need to discuss the events at the community center. Mark tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through his bandaged shoulder. The girl, is she? You're not in a position to ask questions. Matthews cut him off. You're under investigation for compromising a federal operation and endangering the lives of fellow officers. No visitors will be permitted until we complete our inquiry. Through the window, Mark could see a small group gathered on the sidewalk below. They held candles and signs, their faces turned up toward his window. One sign caught his eye. Thank you to the only good cop in Redgate. Matthews noticed his gaze and pulled the blinds shut with a sharp snap. Focus, Harland. This is serious. Your actions put lives at risk. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of pain medication and repeated interrogations. Mark sat in sterile conference rooms, his arm in a sling, while superior officers fired questions at him like bullets. Explain again why you broke formation, Chief Wilson demanded, his jowls quivering with barely contained anger. There were no weapons, Mark repeated for what felt like the 100th time. No gang members. It was a children's reading program. Someone fed us bad intelligence. Officer Denver's your partner has a different recollection, interrupted Deputy Commissioner Hayes, sliding a statement across the table. Would you like to hear his testimony? Before Mark could respond, Hayes began reading. Officer Harland appeared emotionally unstable during the operation. He broke formation without warning, endangering the tactical team and civilian lives. His erratic behavior forced me to discharge my weapon in defense of my fellow officers. Mark's good hand clenched into a fist under the table. That's not what happened, Denver's aimed at a child who was later confirmed to be reaching for an unknown object. Hayes cut in smoothly. Standard protocol in a high-risk situation. She was holding a crayon. The room fell silent. Hayes and Wilson exchanged looks that Mark had seen countless times before. The look of men who had already decided the outcome long before the meeting began. "Mark," Wilson said, his voice suddenly gentle in a way that made Mark's stomach turn. "You have two options. You can resign quietly, today, or we can pursue criminal charges for interference with a federal investigation. Your pension, of course, will be forfeit either way. The union," Mark started, "has reviewed the case and supports the department's position." Hayes finished. "It's over, Mark. Take the deal. Walk away." A blank resignation letter appeared in front of him. Mark stared at it, remembering the little girl's face, the terror in her eyes as she looked down the barrel of Denver's gun. He thought of all the years he'd served, believing he was making a difference, protecting people. Now here he sat, being forced to choose between his principles and his freedom. With a hand that shook slightly, Mark signed the letter. The next morning, Mark stood in the precinct locker room for the last time. He changed out of his uniform into civilian clothes, each movement sending spikes of pain through his injured shoulder. The small box of personal belongings from his locker seemed impossibly light. 15 years of service reduced to a few photos and trinkets. Officers who had once called him friend hurried past, avoiding eye contact. Only Rodriguez, a rookie he'd trained, dared to approach. "I'm sorry, sir," Rodriguez whispered, glancing around nervously. "We all know what really happened." Mark just nodded, unable to find words that wouldn't taste bitter. The walk through the precinct felt endless. Faces turned away as he passed. Conversations died. Even the usual bustle of phones and radios seemed muted, as if the building itself was trying to forget him. Outside, the bright morning sun felt like an accusation. Mark paused on the steps, squinting against the light. Across the street, a cluster of news vans had gathered. In their midst stood a familiar small figure, the girl from the community center, holding her mother's hand as reporters thrust microphones toward them. Captain Bradley's voice drifted across the street as he addressed the cameras. "While we regret this unfortunate misunderstanding during a high-risk operation, we want to assure the community that proper procedures were followed. The department remains committed to protecting all citizens of Redgate." Mark watched the little girl, Willow, he'd learned her name was, as she listened to the lies being told about that night. She turned suddenly, as if sensing his presence, and their eyes met across the distance. In that moment, Mark saw something in her gaze that went beyond her years. A determination, an understanding of the weight of truth. Adjusting the box under his good arm, Mark turned and started walking. Away from the precinct. Away from the cameras. Away from everything he'd thought his life would be. His shoulder throbbed with each step, but he kept moving. Behind him, he could still hear Captain Bradley's voice fading into the morning traffic. "The department thanks the community for their continued trust and support." 6 months crawled by like shadows across a sundial. Mark's new apartment in the east side of Redgate could barely be called home. A single room with peeling wallpaper and windows that rattled when trucks passed. The bed creaked under his weight as he sat up, another sleepless night giving way to a gray dawn. His shoulder protested as he reached for the bottle of pain pills on the nightstand. The prescription label was worn, but the instructions were still clear. Take as needed for pain. These days, he needed them more often than he cared to admit. The physical therapy clinic was a 30-minute bus ride away. Mark sat among elderly patients and sports injuries, watching them chat with family members or friends who'd come for support. When the therapist called his name, he walked in alone, just as he had for the past 24 sessions. "How's the range of motion today, Mr. Harland?" The therapist was young, cheerful, seemingly immune to Mark's perpetual silence. She guided his arm through the exercises, noting his winces. Still getting the nightmares? Mark nodded slightly. Last night had been particularly bad. The community center, the children's screams, Denver's gun. He'd woken up drenched in sweat, his shoulder burning as if he'd been shot all over again. Back home, another stack of rejection letters waited in his mailbox. Security positions, night watchman jobs, even a mall cop opening, all denied. One letter was more direct than the others. While your law enforcement background is noted, recent events make you unsuitable for our organization. Mark crumpled the letter and tossed it toward the overflowing waste paper basket. It missed, joining several empty bottles on the floor. He hadn't meant to start drinking so much, but it helped dull the edges of his thoughts, made the nights a little less sharp. His laptop screen glowed in the dimness, open to yet another job application. The cursor blinked accusingly in the previous employment field. No matter how he worded it, former police officer led to the same Google searches, the same newspaper articles, the same carefully crafted narrative about a rogue cop who'd endangered a federal operation. One morning, Mark found himself on a familiar street, standing across from the community center where everything had changed. The building was dark now, its windows boarded up, a closed until further notice sign hanging crookedly on the door. Yellow crime scene tape, faded and torn, still clung to one corner like a forgotten cobweb. Movement caught his eye. Two figures walking down the sidewalk. His breath caught in his throat. It was Willow and her mother, passing by the center without a glance. The girl had grown taller, her school backpack bouncing as she walked. They passed within feet of where Mark stood, but their eyes slid right over him, just another stranger on the street. He watched them disappear around the corner, his hands trembling slightly. The girl he'd taken a bullet for didn't even recognize him. Maybe that was better. He turned and walked away, leaving the ghost of that night behind him. Night settled over the city like a heavy blanket. Mark sat in his darkened apartment, the only light coming from a street lamp outside his window. An old academy notebook lay open in his lap, its pages yellow with age. His fingers traced over idealistic notes about serving the community, protecting the innocent, upholding justice. A newspaper clipping fell from between the pages, one of the many articles about the raid. The headline read, "Community Center Incident Raises Questions About Police Tactics." Near the bottom was a quote from Mrs. James, Willow's mother, demanding answers. Mark circled Willow's name with a trembling finger. "At least she's okay," he whispered to the empty room, his voice rough from disuse. Outside his window, the seasons began their endless dance. Spring rain gave way to summer heat, then autumn leaves, then winter snow, over and over. The apartment grew more cluttered, more neglected. Bills piled up, dust gathered. The phone rang less and less until it stopped altogether. Mark's presence in the world began to fade like an old photograph left in the sun. Neighbors stopped noticing him. Mail carriers forgot his name. He became a shadow, a ghost story, a cautionary tale whispered in police academy hallways about the cost of standing up to the system. The years continued their relentless march outside his window, but inside, time stood still, frozen in that one moment when a little girl looked up from under a table, crayon in hand, and everything changed forever. The marble floors of the federal courthouse gleamed in the early morning light, polished to mirror shine by the night crew. Camera flashes bounced off the classical columns as reporters jostled for position around a wooden podium. The air buzzed with anticipation, voices echoing off the high ceilings in excited murmurs. Judge Willow James emerged from the east corridor, her black robes flowing with quiet authority. At 26, she was the youngest federal judge ever appointed in the district, but her presence commanded immediate attention. Her steps were measured, deliberate, each click of her heels against marble adding percussion to the sudden hush that fell over the crowd. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and steady. The microphones carried it to every corner of the lobby. "Today marks not just my first day on the bench, but a renewal of our commitment to justice in this district." Cameras clicked rapidly, Willow stood straight-backed, her dark eyes scanning the crowd with unwavering focus. She'd practiced this speech 100 times, but the words came naturally now, powered by 18 years of purpose. "The law is not just words on paper," she continued. "It's a living promise we make to each other. A promise that truth will prevail over power, that justice will reach every corner of our community, and that no one stands above accountability." A reporter raised his hand. "Judge James, at 26, do you feel prepared for such responsibility?" Willow's smile was slight but firm. "Age is not the measure of justice. Understanding is, commitment is, and I've spent my entire life preparing for this role." Questions flew fast after that. About her background, her plans, her unprecedented appointment. Willow handled each with practiced grace, never revealing more than necessary. After 15 minutes, she politely excused herself. She had a full docket waiting. The walk to her chambers took her through quieter hallways, away from the press. Her assistant, Sarah, fell in step beside her with a stack of files. "They're already calling you the people's judge on social media," Sarah said, trying to hide a smile. "Let's earn that title first," Willow replied, reaching for her chamber door. Inside, the main office was everything expected of a federal judge. Leather-bound law books, a massive oak desk, certificates in heavy frames. But through a second door was her private study, and here, Willow's true work came into focus. One entire wall was covered in carefully arranged newspaper clippings, court documents, and photographs. Red strings connected certain pieces, creating a web of relationships and events. At the center was an article about the Redgate Community Center raid, yellowed with age but preserved under glass. Willow approached the wall slowly, her robes whispering against the carpet. Her fingers traced the edge of a rain-streaked photograph. A man lying on wet pavement, blood spreading across his shoulder. Mark Harland. The cop who'd taken a bullet meant for her. The memory was still vivid. The crayon in her hand, the thunder of boots, the terrible sound of the gun. She'd been 8 years old, hiding under a table during story time. Officer Denvers had seen movement, raised his weapon, but Harland had moved faster, diving between them. She'd spent years piecing together what happened after. How the department had turned on Harland, forced him out, buried the truth. How other raids followed the same pattern. Community spaces targeted, evidence planted, witnesses silenced. But she'd been patient, methodical, gathering proof with every step up the legal ladder. Now the wall told the whole story. Confidential reports from whistleblowers inside the department, internal memos showing systematic civil rights violations, testimony from other victims, financial records revealing patterns of asset seizure and corruption, each piece carefully verified, each connection documented. Willow had built allies too. Other judges, federal prosecutors, civil rights attorneys, people who'd seen the same patterns, who'd been waiting for someone with the authority and the evidence to act. Her desk phone buzzed. Sarah's voice came through. "Judge James, the courier delivered that sealed envelope you were waiting for. Send it in, please." The envelope was thick, official, marked with the federal court seal. Willow's hands were steady as she opened it, but her heart raced as she pulled out the documents inside. The first page bore the heading she'd worked 18 years to see: Federal Civil Rights Class Action Lawsuit, Redgate Community versus Redgate Police Department. She flipped through the pages, scanning names, dates, charges. Everything was in order, every detail precise. Then she reached the witness list, and one name made her pause. Mark Harland, former officer, Redgate Police Department. The papers trembled slightly in her hands. She hadn't known if he was still alive, if he could be found. For years, he'd been a ghost, a memory, a symbol of what happened to those who stood against the system. Willow sank into her chair, allowing herself a moment of pure emotion. The little girl who'd hidden under that table, the teenager who'd sworn to find justice, the law student who'd worked through endless nights. They were all present in this moment. Then, like water settling after a stone splash, her composure returned. She leaned forward, placing the documents carefully on her desk. Everything she'd worked for, everything she'd built toward, was finally in motion. "It's time," she said quietly, and reached for her phone to begin making calls. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Mark's apartment windows, painting dark shapes across the worn carpet. Bills and junk mail lay scattered near his door where they'd been pushed through the mail slot. On top of the pile sat a bright pink notice he'd been dreading. Final eviction warning. 3 months behind on rent was 3 months too many. Mark's joints creaked as he bent down to gather the mail. Years of physical therapy hadn't fully healed the old shoulder wound, and some days the pain was worse than others. Today was one of those days. He sorted through the envelopes with practiced resignation. Bill, credit card offer, bill. Then his fingers touched something different. Heavy cream-colored paper, official letterhead, certified mail sticker. His name and address were printed in precise type. Mark Harland, 1247 Cedar Street, Apt 3B. No return address visible. Mark turned the envelope over slowly, a familiar tension creeping into his shoulders. After 18 years of keeping his head down, official mail usually meant trouble. He carried it to his small kitchen table, pulling out a chair that scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. The seal broke with a crisp tear. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents, the first page bearing the header of the United States District Court. Mark's eyes scanned the text, his breath catching as he read. James V. Redgate Police Department, Civil Rights Class Action Lawsuit. James. The name hit him like a physical blow. His hands began to shake as he flipped through the pages, looking for confirmation. There, near the middle of the document, a witness list. His own name jumped out at him. Mark Harland, former officer, Redgate Police Department. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Suddenly he was back there, rain falling hard, children screaming, the terrible crack of the gunshot. Officer Denver's face twisted with rage and fear, the burning pain as the bullet tore through his shoulder. A little girl's wide eyes staring up at him from under a table. Crayon still clutched in her small hand. The papers slipped from his grip, scattering across the table and floor. Mark stumbled to the sink, his legs unsteady. The cold water shocked his system as he splashed it over his face again and again. When he finally looked up, his reflection in the window showed a man he barely recognized. Gray hair unkempt, eyes haunted, shoulders permanently hunched as if still carrying that old weight. "It has to be a mistake," he muttered, water dripping from his chin. Or worse, a trap. Some clever scheme by the department to finally silence him completely. They'd tried before, in the early years after his discharge. Threatening phone calls, mysterious car accidents, job opportunities that vanished as soon as he showed interest. But this felt different. The paperwork was too detailed, too official. And that name, James, could it really be her? The little girl he'd saved, all grown up? Mark paced his small apartment as evening settled in, unable to sit still. The summons papers lay where they'd fallen, demanding his attention. Every few minutes he'd pick them up, read a few lines, then set them down again as if they might burn him. Hours passed. Night crept in. Sleep was impossible. Around midnight, Mark finally gave in to the urge he'd been fighting all evening. He went to his bedroom closet and pulled out an old cardboard box from the back corner. Inside, wrapped in a faded Police Academy t-shirt, was his notebook. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellow with age. Mark handled it carefully as he carried it to his reading chair. He hadn't opened it in years, but he knew exactly what he'd find inside. Tucked between the pages was a newspaper clipping he'd read so many times he'd memorized every word. Young girl survives raid. Questions surround police action at community center. The photo showed Willow James and her mother outside the courthouse, their faces tight with grief and determination. Mark had circled Willow's name in pen, pressing so hard the ink had bled through to the next page. He'd followed her story from afar over the years. Honor student, law school scholarship, rising star in the justice system. But he'd never reached out, never tried to contact her. What could he possibly say? Now here she was again, her name at the top of a federal lawsuit that might finally expose the truth about that night, about all the other nights like it, about a system that punished those who tried to do right and rewarded those who did wrong. Mark looked at the summons again. This time his hands were steady. The fear was still there, but something else was stronger, a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in 18 years. Whatever this was, trap or opportunity, danger or redemption, he knew he had to face it. He picked up the subpoena, reading the court date and time. His testimony was scheduled for next month, just enough time to get his affairs in order, to prepare himself for what was coming. The pink eviction notice caught his eye, but it seemed less important now. Some things mattered more than unpaid rent. Mark returned to his chair, the notebook open in his lap. The newspaper photo of young Willow James stared up at him, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to really look at it, to remember not just the trauma of that night, but the reason he'd acted, the simple, unshakable knowledge that protecting that child had been the right thing to do. He'd paid a heavy price for that choice, lost his career, his reputation, his future. But sitting there in the quiet darkness of his apartment, Mark realized he'd never lost his certainty about that moment. And now, maybe, he had a chance to make that choice mean something more. The morning sun had barely crept over the horizon when Mark stepped onto the Greyhound bus. His worn leather jacket pulled tight against the early autumn chill. He carried only a small backpack containing his notebook, a change of clothes, and the court documents that had upended his quiet existence. The bus was nearly empty, just a few sleepy passengers scattered across the worn blue seats. Mark chose a spot near the middle, settling into the familiar discomfort of public transportation. As the bus rumbled to life, he pressed his forehead against the cool window, watching the city scroll past. Each mile brought him closer to Redgate, closer to the past he'd spent 18 years trying to forget. The journey felt surreal, like watching someone else's life through clouded glass. Other passengers dozed or stared at their phones, unaware that the quiet man in their midst was traveling back toward the epicenter of his own personal earthquake. Mark's reflection in the window looked ghostly, gray hair neat for once, face freshly shaved, but eyes carrying the same haunted depth they'd held since that rainy night. The bus wound through increasingly familiar streets. Old landmarks emerged from the morning mist. The public library where he'd once helped with community outreach programs. The park where he'd walked his beat in happier days. But everything looked different now, transformed by time and progress. As they entered Redgate proper, Mark's breath caught in his throat. The neighborhood had changed dramatically. Gone were the crumbling buildings and empty storefronts, he remembered. In their place stood renovated facades painted in warm colors, their windows clean and welcoming. Murals stretched across entire walls, vibrant scenes of community, justice, and hope. The bus stopped at a light, and Mark found himself staring at a particularly striking piece of street art. It showed a diverse group of children reading together under a protective canopy of raised hands. Something about the image made his chest tight. He recognized the spirit of the old community center in those painted faces. Yet beneath the fresh paint and new construction, Mark could sense an underlying current of tension. It rippled through the way people moved on the sidewalks, in the careful distance they maintained from the occasional passing police car. Some wounds ran too deep for surface improvements to heal completely. The bus turned onto Madison Avenue, and Mark's heart nearly stopped. There, on the corner where the old precinct building had once stood, was a massive construction site. Heavy machinery sat idle in the early morning light, surrounded by tall security fencing. But it was the sign that made him grip the seat in front of him. Future home of the Harlan Center. Justice starts here. Mark stared at his own name emblazoned across the sign, trying to make sense of it. His first thought was that it had to be some other Harland. Surely they hadn't named a justice center after him. But something in his gut told him otherwise. This was too specific, too pointed to be coincidence. The bus continued on, leaving the sign behind, but its image burned in Mark's mind as they approached the government district. The federal courthouse rose before them, an imposing structure of granite and glass that seemed to pierce the morning sky. Mark's hands trembled slightly as he gathered his backpack and made his way to the front of the bus. The courthouse steps were already busy with early morning activity. Lawyers in crisp suits, clerks hurrying with stacks of papers, security guards checking IDs. Mark felt painfully out of place in his simple clothes and worn shoes. He gripped the strap of his backpack tighter, drawing strength from the familiar weight of his notebook inside. The security checkpoint was a blur of metal detectors and polite but firm instructions. Mark's shoulder ached as he lifted his arms for the scan. The old wound always seemed to know when he was stressed. Finally cleared, he approached the information desk where a clerk sat behind thick protective glass. "I'm here as a witness," Mark said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Mark Harland." The clerk typed something into her computer, then nodded. "Third floor, room 317. That's the witness preparation area. Take the elevator to your right." Mark's footsteps echoed in the marble hallway as he made his way to the elevator. Each floor number lit up too slowly. 1, 2, 3. The doors opened onto a quieter corridor, the sounds from below muffled by thick carpet and wood-paneled walls. Room 317 looked like any other door, but to Mark, it might as well have been the gateway to his past. He stood there for a long moment, hand hovering near the handle. Through the frosted glass, he could see movement inside, someone waiting. Taking a deep breath, Mark opened the door. The room was smaller than he expected, furnished with a conference table and comfortable chairs. A young lawyer looked up from a stack of documents, her expression professional but kind. "They're expecting you, Mr. Harland," she said, gesturing toward an inner door. Mark's throat felt dry. "Who is they?" he asked softly. But the lawyer just smiled and indicated the door again. What Mark couldn't see was that behind that door, behind a one-way mirror, Judge Willow James stood perfectly still. Her face betrayed no emotion as she watched the man who had saved her life all those years ago, the man whose sacrifice had set her on the path that led to this moment. She remained silent, observing. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as reporters and camera crews jostled for position. Their equipment created a forest of microphones and lenses, all pointed toward the entrance. The air buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just another court case. This was about to become a watershed moment for civil rights in Redgate. Mark stood in a quiet alcove just inside the building's side entrance, tugging at the collar of his borrowed suit. The jacket was a touch too tight across the shoulders, and the tie felt like it was slowly choking him. A court-appointed assistant had helped him find proper attire for the proceedings, but after 18 years of worn jeans and work shirts, the formal clothing felt like a costume. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. Mark pressed them flat against his thighs, trying to steady himself. Through nearby windows, he could hear the growing crowd outside, their voices creating a steady hum of excitement and speculation. Somewhere in that sea of faces were people who remembered him, both as a hero and a traitor, depending on which side of history they stood. "Mr. Harland?" A young clerk appeared at his elbow. "They're ready for you." Mark nodded, unable to trust his voice. He followed the clerk through a maze of corridors, each step echoing against the polished floors. Other people passed them, lawyers clutching briefcases, court officials in dark robes, but Mark barely registered their presence. His mind was focused entirely on keeping his feet moving forward. They paused outside the main courtroom doors. Through the wood, Mark could hear the murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, the rustle of papers. The clerk gave him an encouraging smile and pushed open the heavy door. The noise hit him first, a wave of whispers and movement that suddenly ceased as he stepped into view. The courtroom was packed, every bench filled with spectators, journalists, and what looked like every civil rights activist in the city. Mark felt hundreds of eyes turned toward him at once. He forced himself to walk forward, focusing on the polished wooden railing that separated the gallery from the court proper. His footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. Someone in the gallery whispered his name, and then another, the sound rippling through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Mark took his seat at the witness table, keeping his eyes fixed on the smooth wood surface in front of him. He could feel the weight of all those stares, all those expectations. The room felt too warm, too close, too full of ghosts from his past. A door opened at the far end of the courtroom. The bailiff's voice rang out clear and strong. "All rise, the Honorable Judge Willow James presiding." Mark stood with everyone else, his movements automatic. He lifted his eyes to watch the judge enter, and felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The woman who walked to the bench moved with grace and authority, her black robes flowing around her like liquid shadow. But it was her face that made Mark's heart stop. Older now, refined by time and purpose, but unmistakable. The same face he'd seen in his dreams and nightmares for 18 years. The little girl he'd thrown himself in front of, now grown into a federal judge. Gasps of recognition spread through the courtroom as people made the connection. This wasn't just any judge presiding over a civil rights case. This was Willow James, survivor of the Redgate raid herself. Mark couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He watched as Willow took her place behind the bench, her expression perfectly composed. Her eyes swept the courtroom once, professionally, before landing on him. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in her gaze. Recognition, emotion, memory. The bailiff was about to begin the formal proceedings when Willow stood. Her voice, clear and steady, cut through the tension in the room. "Before we proceed..." The courtroom fell completely silent as she stepped down from the bench. Her robes whispered against the carpet as she walked forward, each step measured and deliberate. Mark felt rooted to the spot, his mind struggling to process what was happening. She moved through the space between the tables, past surprised lawyers and stunned observers, until she stood directly in front of Mark. Up close, he could see the strength in her bearing, the quiet authority she carried like a mantle. But he could also see, in the slight tremor of her hand as she extended it, that this moment meant as much to her as it did to him. Willow reached out and took Mark's hand in a firm handshake. The gesture was simple but profound, a federal judge publicly acknowledging the man who had saved her life, who had sacrificed everything to protect a child he didn't know. Camera flashes exploded around them like lightning. The courtroom erupted into chaos, people standing, shouting, cameras clicking frantically. Reporters scrambled to capture the historic moment. But Mark barely noticed any of it. He was lost in a fog of disbelief, his hand still clasped in Willow's grip. Words failed him completely. How could he possibly express what he was feeling? The years of isolation, the weight of silence, the crushing doubt, all of it seemed to dissolve in the face of this moment. Willow stepped closer, still holding his hand, and spoke quietly enough that only he could hear. "You didn't just protect me. You made this moment possible." Her words carried the weight of 18 years, of all the changes that had grown from that single act of courage. In her eyes, Mark could see the frightened child he'd protected and the powerful woman she'd become. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, he felt the heavy burden of his past begin to lift. The next morning dawned bright and clear, a stark contrast to the heavy atmosphere inside the federal courthouse. The main courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow rooms set up throughout the building to accommodate the surge of media, activists, and citizens who had flocked to witness what was quickly becoming a landmark civil rights case. Television cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking steadily. National news networks had descended on Redgate overnight, transforming a local story into headline news across the country. Reporters scribbled frantically in notepads while sketch artists captured the scene with quick, precise strokes. Judge Willow James sat at the bench, her posture perfect, her expression neutral but alert. She wore her authority like armor, every movement measured and deliberate. The previous day's emotional reunion with Mark seemed like a distant dream in the face of her current professional composure. The lead civil rights attorney for the plaintiffs, Sarah Chen, rose from her seat. Her dark suit was crisp, her silver hair pulled back severely. She moved to the center of the courtroom with quiet confidence, carrying decades of experience in her steady stride. "Your Honor, members of the court," Chen began, her voice clear and strong. "What we will present today is not just a single incident of police misconduct. This is a pattern spanning decades, a systemic rot at the heart of the Redgate Police Department that has destroyed lives, torn apart families, and betrayed the very community it was sworn to protect." She turned slowly, making eye contact with different sections of the courtroom. "We will show evidence of racial profiling, discriminatory arrest quotas, and deliberate targeting of minority neighborhoods. We will demonstrate how the department's leadership not only allowed these practices but actively encouraged them through policy and promotion." The defense table shifted uncomfortably as Chen approached a large screen that had been set up. "But perhaps most damning," she continued, "we will show how the department engaged in an orchestrated cover-up of its worst offenses, including the infamous community center raid of 2005. Mark sat in the witness area, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. His face remained stoic, but his knuckles were white with tension as Chen began presenting evidence. Document after document appeared on the screen. Internal memos showing arrest quotas broken down by race, training materials with coded language targeting minority communities, promotion records revealing a pattern of rewarding officers with the highest rates of minority arrests. Then came the photographs. The community center before and after the raid, broken doors, scattered books, children's drawings trampled under tactical boots. Each image landed like a physical blow in the silent courtroom. "And now," Chen said, her voice dropping slightly, "we present evidence that was supposedly lost in a convenient computer malfunction 18 years ago." She nodded to a technician. The screen flickered to life with body cam footage. The timestamp showed October 14, 2005. The quality was grainy but clear enough. The perspective bounced as an officer ran through the community center's front door. Screams echoed through the speakers. Children scattered. Parents tried to shield them. Then came the crucial moment. A different camera angle showed Mark Harland, younger and in uniform, scanning the room with growing alarm. His voice could be heard clearly. "Wait, these are just kids. Stand down." The footage jumped to another angle. Officer Carl Denvers, weapon raised, advancing on a table. Movement underneath. A small hand holding a crayon appeared. The muzzle flash was blindingly bright. Gasps filled the courtroom as the video showed Mark diving forward, taking the bullet meant for young Willow. The camera caught his face as he fell, twisted in pain but still trying to shield the child beneath him. The defense attorneys erupted in objections, jumping to their feet. "Your Honor, this footage cannot be authenticated. The chain of custody is unclear, and the department's records show all cameras malfunctioned that night." Willow raised her hand slightly, silencing the protests. Her voice was measured and precise as she spoke. "The footage has been authenticated by 3 independent digital forensics experts. Chain of custody has been established through sworn testimony from the department's former IT specialist. Objection overruled." The morning proceeded with a methodical presentation of evidence, each piece building upon the last to create a devastating picture of institutional corruption. The defense team's attempts to interrupt or discredit the evidence were met with calm, legally precise rejections from Judge James. As the morning session drew to a close, Chen straightened her papers. The plaintiffs call Mark Harlan to the stand. A hush fell over the courtroom. Mark rose slowly from his seat, his left hand gripping the wooden rail for support. The old injury in his shoulder had never fully healed, and stress always made it worse. Each step toward the witness stand seemed to take tremendous effort, not just physical but emotional. The bailiff approached with a Bible. Mark placed his right hand on it, his left still gripping the stand for balance. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?" "I do." His voice was rough from disuse, barely above a whisper. Mark lowered himself carefully into the witness chair. The entire courtroom seemed to lean forward slightly, hanging on this moment. He lifted his eyes and found Willow's across the room. In that brief exchange of glances, 18 years of silence and sacrifice passed between them. Chen approached the stand. "Mr. Harland, can you describe what happened on the night of October 14th, 18 years ago?" Mark drew in a deep breath. His hands, resting on the small ledge before him, finally stopped shaking. For nearly 2 decades, he had carried this story alone, had watched it be twisted and buried by those in power. Now, finally, he could speak the truth. He leaned slightly toward the microphone and began to speak. Mark's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the paper cup of water on the witness stand. The courtroom silence was deafening, broken only by the rapid-fire clicks of camera shutters from the media section. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the wood-paneled walls seemed to trap the tension like a pressure cooker. He took a careful sip, buying precious seconds to steady himself. In the gallery, dozens of faces watched his every movement. Some were familiar, community members who'd been there that night, now grown older. Others were strangers, drawn by the national coverage of a case that had finally broken through nearly 2 decades of institutional silence. The civil rights attorney, Sarah Chen, stood quietly, allowing Mark this moment to collect himself. Her patience spoke volumes. She understood the weight of what was coming. "Mr. Harland," Chen began gently, "please tell us about the briefing you received before the raid on October 14th, 2005. Mark leaned forward slightly toward the microphone. His voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. "We were told it was a gang safe house," he said. "Intelligence claimed there were weapons, drugs, possibly hostages. They said it was a major operation, time-sensitive. But something felt wrong from the start." "What felt wrong, Mr. Harland?" "The intel was vague. No specific gang named, no confirmed weapons, and the location." He shook his head. "It was a known community center. I'd driven past it dozens of times on patrol. There were always kids there, after-school programs. Did you raise these concerns?" "I tried. Asked my sergeant about verification. He said it came from up top and to fall in line." Mark's jaw tightened. Officer Denvers was particularly eager. He kept checking his weapon, talking about finally cleaning up the neighborhood. Chen nodded. "What happened when you arrived at the scene?" Mark's eyes grew distant, seeing not the courtroom but that rainy night 18 years ago. "We could see through the windows. There were children inside reading books, parents helping with homework. But Denvers was already moving, shouting orders. He was." Mark paused, choosing his words carefully. "He was amped up, aggressive. Started kicking in doors before the signal was even given." The description continued, painting a vivid picture of chaos erupting in what should have been a safe space. Mark's voice grew hoarse as he described children screaming, volunteers trying to protect them, the sound of books and art supplies scattering across the floor. "Then I saw movement under one of the tables," Mark said, his composure cracking for the first time. "Just a small hand, holding a crayon, a purple crayon." He stopped, swallowing hard. "But Denvers, he was shouting about a weapon. His gun was up. I saw his finger tightening on the trigger." Tears welled in Mark's eyes, but he didn't brush them away. "I couldn't let her die," he said, voice breaking. "She was just a little girl. Drawing pictures, I couldn't." He took another sip of water, hands shaking more noticeably now. In her judge's seat, Willow maintained her professional composure. but her fingers gripped the edge of her desk just a fraction tighter. The defense attorney, a sharp-featured man named Harrison, stood for cross-examination. His approach was immediate and aggressive. "Mr. Harland, isn't it true that you were discharged from the force for mental instability?" "Objection," Chen called out. "Mischaracterization of the record." "Sustained," Willow ruled, her voice steady. Harrison adjusted his approach. "Mr. Harland, you disobeyed direct orders that night, did you not?" "I followed my training and my conscience," Mark replied quietly. "We're taught to assess threats and protect innocent life. And yet your employment records after leaving the force show significant gaps. Multiple failed job applications, periods of unemployment. Would you say you were stable during those years?" Mark met the attorney's gaze directly. "I was blacklisted. Every application mysteriously fell through once they checked my references. The department made sure of that." Harrison pulled out a thick folder. "We have records of concerning behavior, drinking, isolation, multiple addresses suggesting inability to maintain stable housing. How can we trust your recollection of events from 18 years ago when your life since then has been so chaotic?" The question hung in the air for a moment. Mark straightened in his chair, something shifting in his demeanor. When he spoke, his voice was clear and firm. "I remember every detail of that night because I've relived it every day for 18 years. I remember the sound of that little girl's crayon scratching on paper just before Denver's pulled the trigger. I remember the weight of my body as I dove forward, and the burn of the bullet tearing through my shoulder. I remember thinking, as I lay bleeding on that floor, that at least she was safe." He leaned forward slightly, his next words carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. "I would take that bullet again. And again. The difference is, I'd make sure the whole world was watching this time." Camera flashes exploded from the back of the room. Reporters frantically scribbled in their notepads. On the bench, Willow's eyes remained fixed on Mark, her expression unreadable but intense. Outside the courthouse, phones were already lighting up with notifications. Video clips of Mark's testimony began circulating on social media, spreading like wildfire across the internet. His words, "I would take that bullet again," became an instant rallying cry, shared and reshared thousands of times within minutes. The truth, buried for 18 years, was finally seeing the light of day. And this time, the whole world was indeed watching. The evening news anchor's face filled the screen, her expression grave as she delivered the breaking update on the Redgate trial. Behind her, an unflattering photo of Mark appeared, a grainy surveillance shot from years ago, making him look haggard and suspicious. Tonight, troubling allegations have emerged about former officer Mark Harland, the anchor announced. An anonymous source close to the investigation claims Harland displayed what they describe as unusual interest in following the victim's life after the incident. The screen split to show clips from Mark's testimony alongside old newspaper clippings. The narrative being woven was subtle but toxic, suggesting darker motivations behind his actions that night. Records indicate Harland kept extensive files on the James family, the reporter continued, referencing Mark's worn notebook with its collected articles. What had been a desperate attempt to ensure Willow's survival and success was being twisted into something sinister. Social media exploded with speculation. Tabloid websites posted lurid headlines. Hero cop or hidden stalker? Questions arise about officers' true motives. The character assassination was swift and methodical. In his small motel room just outside the courthouse district, Mark sat on the edge of the bed, watching the broadcast with growing horror. The cheap bedspread crinkled under his grip as the allegations continued to pile up. Each new revelation felt like a physical blow. The room's dated wallpaper and harsh fluorescent lighting created deep shadows across his face as he watched his reputation being dismantled for a second time. The TV's glow flickered across water stains on the ceiling, while reporters debated his psychological state and obsessive tendencies. His phone buzzed, a text from Chen, Willow's lead attorney. Don't panic. We expected this. They're desperate. It rang moments later. Mark answered with trembling hands. Mr. Harland. Chen's voice was steady and professional. We need you to stay calm. This is a classic intimidation tactic. They're trying to discredit you before tomorrow's session. They're making it sound like... Mark's voice cracked. We know exactly what they're doing. Chen cut in. Judge James anticipated this move. We have contingencies in place. The source is almost certainly connected to Denver's. He's getting scared. But Mark wasn't really listening anymore. The room felt too small, the air too thick. I need to go, he mumbled, disconnecting the call despite Chen's protests. He grabbed his jacket and headed outside, desperate for fresh air. The motel's neon sign cast a harsh red glow across the nearly empty parking lot. A light drizzle had started, matching his mood as he began walking with no particular destination in mind. The streets were quiet at this hour. Most businesses closed. His reflection caught in darkened storefront windows, a tired man trying to outpace ghosts that refused to let go. Every passing car made him tense, wondering if more reporters were hunting him down. He had almost circled the block when he heard footsteps behind him. Mark's old cop instincts kicked in. Someone was definitely following him. He turned slowly, bracing himself for another confrontation with the media. Instead, he found himself facing a young black man in his early 20s, wearing a Redgate Community College sweatshirt. The young man's expression was earnest, almost nervous. Mr. Harland? The young man asked, keeping a respectful distance. I thought it was you. I'm Marcus Washington. Mark nodded warily, still expecting an ambush of some kind. You were there that night at the community center, weren't you? Marcus continued. During the raid? Another slow nod. Mark's shoulder ached with the memory. My older sister was there too. She was one of the kids in the reading program. Marcus shifted his weight, choosing his words carefully. She told me about it later, about the cop who got shot protecting someone. We never knew your name back then, but we never forgot what you did. Mark stood very still, rain gathering on his jacket. After the news broadcast, he'd expected accusations, not this quiet acknowledgement. I saw you on the news today, Marcus said, finally telling the truth about what happened. My whole family watched it. A lot of people in Redgate did. The news is saying other things now, Mark replied bitterly. Marcus shook his head. We know what they're trying to do. But we also know what really went down that night. The community remembers. He stepped forward and extended his hand. Thanks for not running from it. For staying and telling the truth, even after all this time. Mark stared at the offered hand for a moment before accepting it. The handshake was firm, genuine, a simple gesture of respect that felt monumental after 18 years of suspicion and isolation. Your testimony matters, Marcus added. No matter what they say about you now, the truth matters. They stood there in the rain for a moment longer, 2 generations connected by a single night of violence and courage. Then Marcus gave a small nod and continued on his way, leaving Mark standing under the streetlight, his hand still warm from the handshake. Meanwhile, across town in her chambers, Judge Willow James was holding an emergency meeting with her legal team. The news broadcast played silently on a laptop in the corner while she stood at her window, looking out over the city lights. Denver's is panicking, she said without turning around. These accusations, the anonymous source, it's sloppy, desperate. Chen nodded, spreading documents across Willow's desk. He's trying to poison the well before we get to his testimony. Classic deflection. Let him dig, Willow replied, finally turning to face her team. Her expression was calm but determined. Every attack on Mark's character just proves how afraid they are of what he knows. The room fell quiet as they watched their judge. The little girl from that night, now a powerful force for justice, plan their next moves in a game 18 years in the making. The next morning, the courthouse buzzed with renewed energy. Media crews jostled for position as a new witness entered through a side door. Micah Boone, former Redgate police officer turned private investigator. His presence drew curious whispers from the gallery. Unlike Mark's weathered appearance, Boone carried himself with the calculated precision of someone used to working in shadows. He took the stand with practiced ease, adjusting his dark suit jacket as he settled into the witness chair. The plaintiff's attorney approached, establishing his credentials. 15 years on the force, most spent in close proximity to the department's power players, including Carl Denvers. Mr. Boone, the attorney began, could you describe the unofficial policies regarding arrests in predominantly black neighborhoods during your time with Redgate PD? Boone leaned slightly forward, his voice clear and steady. There were quotas. Not written down, of course, but every officer knew the expectations. We called them performance metrics. Each shift needed a certain number of stops, searches, and arrests, especially in what they termed high-risk areas. And these areas were predominantly black neighborhoods. Young black men were particular targets. Officers who didn't meet their numbers found themselves assigned to desk duty or passed over for promotion. The defense attorney shot up. Objection, Your Honor. Speculation. Willow's response was measured. The witness is testifying to direct observations during his employment. Overruled. Boone continued, pulling out a small notebook. I kept records. Dates. Locations. Specific instructions from supervisors. Officer Williams was told to clean up the basketball courts near Martin Luther King Boulevard. That meant arrest quotas. Officer Chen was reprimanded for insufficient activity in the East Side District, code for not enough arrests of black youth. The plaintiff's attorney nodded. And what happened to officers who questioned these practices? They were isolated, assigned to dangerous areas without backup, given impossible schedules. Many quit. Those who stayed learned to play along. The testimony shifted to evidence tampering. Boone described how small amounts of drugs would appear in evidence logs without proper documentation, how weapons were discovered in areas where increased patrols were desired. Each revelation landed like a physical blow in the silent courtroom. The department needed to justify its budget increases, Boone explained. Federal grants required certain crime statistics. If those numbers weren't high enough naturally, they were helped along. Then came the bombshell. Boone produced a thick folder of financial records, meticulously organized. While investigating corruption in the department, I discovered unusual payments flowing between private prison contractors and shell companies connected to senior officers, particularly Carl Denvers. The defense erupted in objections. Willow called for order, her gavel crack echoing through the chamber. Your Honor, the defense attorney protested. These allegations are completely unfounded and prejudicial. I have documentation, Boone responded calmly. Bank records, shell company registrations, meeting minutes. Denvers received consulting fees from private prison operators while simultaneously pushing policies that increased incarceration rates in minority communities. Willow studied the documents presented to her bench. After a moment, she looked up. The documentation appears properly authenticated. The testimony may proceed. The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs as Boone detailed the scheme. Dates of payments aligned with spikes in arrest rates. Construction contracts for new prison facilities were awarded to companies connected to department leadership. Training programs were outsourced to security firms that kicked back portions of their fees. It was a perfect circle, Boone explained. More arrests meant more prisoners meant more private prison contracts. Those contracts generated payments that incentivized even more arrests. The victims were always the same, young black men and women from Redgate's poorest neighborhoods. As Boone's testimony continued, the scene shifted to Denver's office across town. The former police captain, now a prominent political figure, watched the live stream with growing rage. His campaign manager paced nervously behind him. Sir, the donors are getting nervous, the manager reported. The Heritage Foundation just pulled their commitment. The police union is discussing withdrawing their endorsement. Denvers barely seemed to hear him. His eyes were fixed on the screen where Boone, his former protege, was systematically dismantling his career. With a sudden violent motion, he grabbed a framed photo from his desk and hurled it against the wall. Glass shattered across the expensive carpet. 20 years, he snarled. 20 years building this and they think they can tear it down in a day? The campaign manager flinched. Sir, maybe we should consider. Consider what? Denver spun to face him. Rolling over? Letting that sanctimonious little judge and her pet witnesses destroy everything we built? He stalked to his desk and snatched up his phone, jabbing at the keypad with trembling fingers. After a moment, someone answered. It's me, Denvers growled. I need you to find me something on her brother. Everyone's got secrets. Dig until you find them. The campaign manager watched nervously as Denver's face twisted into a cruel smile at whatever response came through the phone. The afternoon sun cast harsh shadows across the office, highlighting the shattered glass and torn photographs scattered across the floor, physical evidence of a powerful man's world beginning to crumble. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Judge Willow James's chambers. The bustling courthouse had grown quiet, leaving her alone with her thoughts in a weathered manila envelope she'd avoided opening for years. Her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal on her brother Langston's death report. The familiar ache in her chest returned as she spread the documents across her mahogany desk. The official cause of death stared back at her in cold, clinical terms. Accidental overdose. She'd never believed it. Langston had been clean for years, working as a youth mentor at the community center. The pages felt thin and brittle under her fingers as she examined them more closely. The toxicology report was oddly vague, missing specific drug levels that should have been standard procedure. The witness statements were hastily scrawled, the handwriting deliberately messy in crucial sections. Even the time of death seemed uncertain, with multiple crossed-out entries. Something's wrong here, she whispered, pulling out her reading glasses for a closer look. The signature at the bottom of the medical examiner's report was smudged, almost as if someone had deliberately run their thumb across the wet ink. A soft knock at her door made her start. Micah Boone stood in the doorway, his expression grave. Behind him, a young officer in plain clothes shifted nervously. The rookie who'd been secretly feeding them internal documents for weeks. Your Honor, Micah said quietly, we found something you need to see. Willow gestured them inside, and they approached her desk with a stack of papers. The young officer, barely more than a kid really, pulled out a copied dispatch log, his hands shaking slightly. This was buried in the archived radio transcripts, he explained. They filed it under the wrong date, probably on purpose, but the timestamp matches. Micah spread the documents out alongside Langston's death report. Look at the location codes. Your brother wasn't found in some alley like they claimed. He was at the community center during the raid. Willow's heart began to pound as she compared the times and dates. That's impossible. They said he died 3 days before the raid. They lied, Micah said softly. We found more. Ballistics reports that were never filed. Witness statements that disappeared. Medical records that were altered. The young officer pulled out more papers with trembling hands. The bullet they dug out of him. It matches a specific type of ammunition. Custom loads, special order. Only one officer in the department used them. Denver's, Willow whispered. Micah nodded grimly. His off-the-books backup piece. Not department issued, but everyone knew he carried it. The same gun that fired at you that night. The pieces started falling into place with horrible clarity. Langston had been at the community center that night. He must have seen something, known something. And Denver's. Willow's vision blurred as she stared at the proof spread across her desk. Her brother hadn't died of an overdose in some forgotten corner of the city. He'd been shot in the back, his death covered up, his memory tarnished with a lie about drugs and poor choices. The young officer spoke up softly. The medical examiner who signed off on the false report? He retired 2 weeks later with a full pension and a new beach house in Florida. The witnesses who gave statements? All of them had prior charges mysteriously disappear. Willow pressed her hands flat against her desk, fighting to maintain her composure. Years of judicial training warred with the raw grief threatening to overwhelm her. Her brother had died trying to protect those kids, just like Mark had nearly died protecting her. And for 18 years, she'd lived with a false story about his death. "The doctored report," she managed to say, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. "Who authorized it?" Micah pointed to a barely legible signature at the bottom of one form. "Acting Captain Carl Denvers." He wasn't just covering up the raid, he was covering up murder. With methodical precision born from years of legal practice, Willow began making copies of everything. Her hands moved automatically while her mind raced through the implications. This wasn't just about police brutality or corruption anymore. This was premeditated murder and conspiracy reaching to the highest levels of the department. She slipped the copies into her briefcase and locked it with a decisive click. Walking to the courthouse windows, she looked out over the city lights beginning to twinkle in the growing dusk. The community center was visible in the distance, its newly renovated facade a testament to change and resilience. "This was never just about me," she whispered to herself, touching the cool glass. Across town, in his campaign office, Carl Denvers sat in the dim light of multiple TV screens. They showed his upcoming mayoral debate prep footage on mute, practiced smiles and rehearsed gestures playing out in endless silent loops. His phone buzzed on the desk, displaying a simple message that made his blood run cold. "She knows." The morning sun filtered through the high courthouse windows, casting long rectangles of light across the packed gallery. Reporters hunched forward in their seats, pens hovering over notepads. The air crackled with anticipation as whispers rippled through the crowd about a surprise witness who could break the case wide open. Mark Harlan sat in the front row behind the plaintiff's table, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He'd noticed the increased security presence this morning, federal marshals positioned at every exit, their watchful eyes scanning the room continuously. Something big was coming. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Willow James presiding. Willow entered with measured steps, her black robes flowing behind her. After the formal opening, she nodded to the plaintiff's lead attorney. "You may call your next witness." The attorney stood, straightening his tie. The plaintiff's call officer Devin Cole. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. On the defense side, several Redgate PD officials leaned forward, their faces darkening with recognition. Carl Denvers, seated with his lawyers, went completely still. The heavy doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Officer Devin Cole entered, flanked by 2 federal marshals. He was young, maybe mid-20s, and his dark skin glistened with nervous sweat under the fluorescent lights. His police uniform looked freshly pressed, but his hands shook slightly as he made his way to the witness stand. As he passed the defense table, Denver's eyes bored into him. Cole kept his gaze forward, his jaw clenched tight. After being sworn in, he sat down, adjusting his collar as if it were suddenly too tight. "Please state your name and occupation for the record," the attorney began. "Officer Devin Cole. I'm currently employed by the Redgate Police Department, badge number 2274. His voice was quiet but clear. "How long have you been with the department?" 3 years, sir." Cole's eyes flickered briefly to Willow. She gave him an almost imperceptible nod, her expression professionally neutral but her eyes conveying silent support. He seemed to draw strength from it, sitting up straighter. "Officer Cole, can you tell us about the department's data management system?" "Yes, sir." Cole reached into his breast pocket and removed a USB drive, handing it to the court clerk. "I've been documenting irregularities in our crime statistics reporting for the past 18 months. The attorney nodded to a technician, who connected the drive to a large display screen visible to the entire court. Cole's voice grew steadier as he walked the court through a series of screenshots and spreadsheets. These are the real-time records from our internal database. The highlighted sections show how arrest statistics and threat assessments were systematically altered. He pointed to specific entries. See these timestamps? The original data shows minimal criminal activity in these neighborhoods, but within hours the numbers would be inflated, sometimes by 200 or 300%. The defense attorneys began objecting rapidly, but Willow overruled them each time, her gaze never leaving the evidence being presented. Cole continued, his voice growing stronger. The manipulated data was used to justify aggressive patrol tactics, military-grade equipment requisitions, and high-force raids, primarily in black neighborhoods. He pulled up another screenshot. This internal memo shows direct orders from Captain Denvers establishing daily aggression quotas, minimum numbers of confrontational stops and forceful arrests officers were required to make. The courtroom erupted in angry murmurs. Willow tapped her gavel once, restoring order. "What happened to officers who failed to meet these quotas?" the attorney asked. Cole's hands clenched the edge of the witness stand. They were punished, reassigned to desk duty, given graveyard shifts, passed over for promotion. Some were fired for manufactured infractions. Others were threatened, their families followed, their phones tapped. "Did you personally witness these threats?" "Yes, sir." Cole's voice cracked slightly. Last month, Officer Sarah Martinez refused to falsify arrest reports. The next day, someone broke into her house while her kids were sleeping. Nothing was taken, but her children's school photos were arranged on the kitchen table. The message was clear. The defense attorney stood up. "Objection. Speculation. Overruled," Willow stated firmly. "Continue, Officer Cole." Cole pulled up more documents, internal emails, text messages, surveillance photos. Each piece of evidence revealed a deeper layer of systematic corruption. The young officer's testimony painted a picture of a department that had become a machine of intimidation and control rather than protection and service. As the morning wore on, Cole's composure began to crack. His voice grew thick with emotion as he described watching fellow officers plant evidence, falsify reports, and brutalize civilians while supervisors looked the other way. Finally, he stopped, his shoulders shaking slightly. "We weren't fighting crime," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were building a war." The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, his approach aggressive from the start. "Officer Cole, isn't it true that you're currently under investigation for insubordination?" "Yes, sir. After I refused to participate in falsifying evidence last month. And isn't it convenient that you've suddenly developed a conscience now that federal investigators are involved?" Cole straightened in his chair. "No, sir. I've been gathering this evidence for 18 months, long before the federal investigation began. I couldn't stay silent anymore." The defense attorney tried several more angles, questioning Cole's competence, suggesting personal grudges, implying professional jealousy. But the young officer held firm, his answers remaining consistent and clear despite his obvious emotional distress. Finally, Willow raised her hand. "Court will recess for 1 hour." She brought down her gavel with a sharp crack. As the gallery began to empty, television screens in the courthouse lobby were already showing breaking news coverage. Denver's face dominated every channel, accompanied by headlines like "Paulus Captain Exposed," "Systematic Corruption in Redgate PD," and "War on Citizens, Police Data Manipulation Revealed." Denver stormed out of the courtroom, his face twisted with rage as cameras flashed around him. His campaign manager hurried after him, already on the phone with crisis management teams. But the damage was done. The carefully constructed image of the tough but fair police captain running for mayor had crumbled, revealing the rot beneath. Inside the now empty courtroom, Cole sat alone at the witness stand, his head in his hands. Federal marshals stood guard nearby, a stark reminder of the protection he now required. He had done what few dared to do. He had spoken truth to power from within the system itself. The cost would be high, but as he looked up at Willow's bench, he knew it had been worth it. The evening sun cast long shadows through the windows of Gloria James' modest home in Redgate. Willow stood in the doorway of her childhood home, her briefcase feeling heavier than usual. Her mother's familiar embrace welcomed her. But Gloria's eyes quickly caught the serious expression on her daughter's face. "Baby, what's wrong?" Gloria asked, leading Willow to the worn but well-kept dining room table. The same one where the family had shared countless meals, where Langston had done his homework, where life had once felt normal. Willow's hands trembled slightly as she opened her briefcase. She removed the files with deliberate care, as if handling something fragile and dangerous at the same time. The manila folder made a soft sound as it hit the wooden table. "Mama," Willow said softly, "I need you to see something." Gloria sat down slowly, her eyes fixed on the folder. She'd seen enough official documents in her life to recognize what they were: police reports, medical records, the kind of papers that changed lives forever. Willow spread out the documents one by one. The original autopsy report, the doctored toxicology results, the buried dispatch logs, and finally, the ballistics report that matched the bullet to Denver's unofficial weapon. Each piece of paper told part of a story that had been hidden for nearly 2 decades. Gloria's hands hovered over the papers, not quite touching them. Her reading glasses sat untouched beside her. Perhaps she wasn't ready to see the truth in such stark black and white. The silence in the room grew thick, broken only by the distant sound of children playing outside and the gentle hum of the old ceiling fan. Family photos watched from the walls. Langston's high school graduation picture seemed to draw both women's eyes. "They said it was drugs," Gloria finally whispered, her voice catching. "They said my boy." "It wasn't drugs, Mama." Willow's voice was gentle but firm. "Langston was at the community center that night, the same night they came for me. The same night Officer Harlan took that bullet." Gloria's hands began to shake. She reached for the dispatch log, finally putting on her glasses. Her eyes moved across the page, growing wider with each line she read. "They shot him," she said, her voice hollow. "They shot my baby and then they—" She couldn't finish the sentence. The papers slipped from her fingers, scattering across the table. Willow moved to her mother's side, kneeling beside her chair. "He was running away from the raid. Denver shot him in the back. Then they covered it up, changed the reports, falsified the autopsy, buried the evidence." Gloria's body began to shake with silent sobs. Willow held her mother as years of grief transformed into raw anger. The truth they'd suspected but could never prove was finally laid bare on their dining room table. After what seemed like hours, Gloria's sobs quieted. She straightened in her chair, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I knew," she said quietly. "A mother knows. Langston never touched drugs. He was too smart, too careful. But they made me doubt myself, made me wonder if I didn't know my own son." Willow stood up slowly, gathering the scattered papers. "I'm adding a wrongful death charge to the civil suit," she said. "Second-degree murder with a cover-up. The evidence is solid. We can prove it now." Gloria was quiet for a long moment, staring at Langston's photo on the wall. When she turned back to Willow, her eyes were clear and fierce. "Don't let them bury another black boy," she said, her voice strong despite its softness. "Not again." Willow nodded, carefully placing the documents back in her briefcase. She hugged her mother tightly, drawing strength from the woman who had raised her to never back down from the truth, no matter how painful. Later that night in her chambers, Willow sat at her desk under the soft glow of her desk lamp. The amendment to the civil suit took shape on her computer screen as her fingers moved steadily across the keyboard. Each word was precise, each legal citation carefully chosen. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about bringing her brother's truth into the light. She paused in her typing and stood up, walking to the evidence board that covered one wall of her chambers. Her fingers traced the edges of the yellowed newspaper clipping about Mark Harland. The headline, "Officer Down in Community Center Raid," still bold after all these years. From her briefcase, she removed a photo of Langston, his bright smile frozen in time, full of promise and dreams that would never be realized. With careful movements, she pinned it next to Mark's article. The two pieces of evidence seemed to speak to each other across the years. One man who tried to prevent a tragedy, and one young man who couldn't be saved. Together, they formed the cornerstone of a case that would expose not just individual acts of violence, but an entire system built on lies and cover-ups. Willow stepped back, looking at the growing web of evidence on her wall. Langston's photo and Mark's article sat at the center, 2 points where justice had failed, now becoming the key to making it right. She returned to her desk and continued drafting the amendment, her brother's smile watching over her shoulder as she worked late into the night. The morning sun filtered through the high courthouse windows, casting long rectangles of light across the packed gallery. The air felt electric with anticipation as Judge Willow James took her seat at the bench, her black robes settling around her with quiet authority. People shifted in their seats, the wooden benches creaking under the weight of expectation. Reporters clutched their notepads, pens poised and ready. "The court will now hear the plaintiff's motion to introduce new evidence," she announced, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the hushed murmurs. The prosecution approached with 3 thick folders, each labeled with meticulous care, the attorney's polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "Your Honor, we submit into evidence the complete autopsy report of Langston James, previously sealed dispatch logs from October 14th, and ballistics analysis matching a recovered bullet to Officer Denver's unauthorized weapon." The prosecutor's hands were steady, but his eyes burned with purpose. The defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. One leaned over to whisper urgently to Denver's, whose face had grown ashen. Beads of sweat formed along his hairline despite the courtroom's cool air conditioning. Willow reviewed the motion with careful deliberation, though she knew every word by heart. Her expression remained neutral, professional, even as her heart thundered in her chest. She ran her finger along the edge of the document, taking her time, following procedure to the letter. "Motion granted," she declared. "The evidence may be presented." Her gavel tapped once, the sound reverberating through the hushed room. The lead prosecutor stood, holding up a small digital recorder. "The court's attention, please. This audio was recovered from a damaged body cam unit found in evidence storage. It contains 9 seconds of audio from the night of the raid." He handled the device as if it were made of glass, precious and fragile. The courtroom fell silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and creaking of chairs ceased. Mark Harland, sitting in the back row of the gallery, leaned forward slightly, his hand gripping the bench in front of him until his knuckles turned white. The prosecutor pressed play. Static crackled through the speakers, then cleared. Shouts and chaos filled the background, but one voice cut through with crystal clarity. "Take the big one down." Denver's voice, unmistakable. The timestamp matched the exact moment Langston was shot. The words hung in the air like smoke, impossible to wave away. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. A woman in the gallery began to cry softly, her shoulders shaking as she pressed a tissue to her mouth. Willow's hands tightened imperceptibly on the edge of her bench, but her face remained composed, the perfect picture of judicial impartiality. The prosecutor proceeded methodically through the evidence. The dispatch logs showed Langston's presence at the community center, his name highlighted in yellow on the printed pages. The autopsy report, when compared with the doctored version, revealed obvious alterations, entire paragraphs changed, measurements modified, conclusions rewritten. The ballistics report linked the fatal bullet directly to Denver's unofficial sidearm, a weapon that should never have been at the scene, a gun that wasn't registered in the department's records. Denver's defense team huddled together, papers flying between them in barely controlled panic. Their lead attorney stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your Honor, we move for a mistrial on the grounds of prejudicial new evidence." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his desperation. Willow's response was immediate and firm. "Motion denied. The evidence was properly submitted, and meets all requirements for late introduction under federal rules of procedure. Her eyes never left his, unwavering. The defense attorney's face reddened. Then we request a recess to prepare. Denied, Willow cut in. The prosecution may proceed. She folded her hands on the bench, the gold of her simple ring catching the light. The next hour unfolded like a slow-motion collision. The prosecution called for Denvers to take the stand. He rose slowly, his usual swagger replaced by a stiff, mechanical movement. His expensive suit seemed to hang on him differently now, as if he'd somehow shrunk inside it. "I invoke my Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination," he stated flatly, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. The words seemed to echo through the courtroom. In the gallery, reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. One slipped out, already typing on his phone, no doubt rushing to break the story that would end Denver's mayoral campaign before sunset. Camera phones discreetly captured the moment despite the court's restrictions. Mark watched from his seat, his eyes glistening. He remembered Denvers as the confident, aggressive officer who dominated the precinct. Now he saw an old man, cornered by his own actions, finally facing what he'd done. The satisfaction Mark felt was tempered by a deep sadness for all the years lost, all the lives damaged. Willow sat straight-backed on the bench, her gaze fixed on Denver's. There was no triumph in her expression, no hint of personal satisfaction. Her eyes held something deeper, the steady, unwavering look of someone who had waited years to speak truth to power. She thought briefly of her brother, wondering if he could somehow see this moment. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't about making Denver suffer. This was about naming what happened, about bringing dark things into the light where they could no longer hide. This was about justice, pure, clean, and long overdue. As the afternoon light began to fade, Willow called for adjournment. The gallery slowly emptied, the air thick with whispered conversations and shocked expressions. Denvers remained at the defense table, staring at nothing, his fingers tracing invisible patterns on the polished wood. In the parking garage beneath the courthouse, two federal marshals waited quietly beside their vehicle. They watched as Denvers emerged from the elevator, flanked by his attorneys. His campaign manager trailed behind, already on the phone trying to manage the impending media disaster, his voice echoing against the concrete walls. The marshals stepped forward, badges glinting under the fluorescent lights. Their faces were professionally neutral, but their posture spoke of determination. "Carl Denvers," one announced formally, "you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, perjury, and multiple counts of civil rights violations." Denvers didn't fight. He didn't argue or try to run. His shoulders slumped as the marshals read him his rights. His attorneys stood helplessly by, watching their client being handcuffed with practiced efficiency, the metal clicking shut with finality. As they led him toward the waiting vehicle, Denvers muttered something so quietly that only the nearest marshal caught it. "She was just a kid." The words hung in the empty garage as the car door closed behind him. The sound of the engine starting echoed off the concrete walls, then faded into silence as they drove away, leaving nothing but the hum of fluorescent lights and the scent of exhaust. The morning sun streamed through the tall courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the packed gallery. Every seat was filled, with people standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Community leaders sat in the front rows, their faces solemn and expectant. National press crews huddled near the back, cameras ready. Federal observers in dark suits occupied a reserved section, their notepads open and pens poised. The air crackled with anticipation. Whispered conversations created a low hum throughout the room, like the buzz before a thunderstorm. Everyone knew this wasn't just another day in court. This was history in the making. When Willow James entered, the room fell silent. She wore a fitted black suit instead of her judicial robes, the choice deliberate and striking. Her heels clicked against the polished floor with each measured step. Her shoulders carried the weight of 2 decades of injustice, but her spine was straight, her chin lifted with quiet determination. Mark Harland sat in the middle of the gallery, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The years of isolation and shame had etched deep lines around his eyes, but today they held a different kind of intensity, the kind that comes from witnessing long-buried truths finally rising to the surface. Willow took her place behind the bench, remaining standing. The bailiff called the court to order, his voice echoing in the hushed chamber. She surveyed the room slowly, her gaze touching each section of the gallery before settling on the documents before her. "Before I deliver this ruling," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I want to acknowledge everyone in this room, the families who lost loved ones, the witnesses who found the courage to speak, the investigators who refused to let evidence stay buried, and those who suffered in silence, carrying the burden of truth through years of institutional denial." She lifted a thick document from her desk. After careful consideration of all evidence presented, including previously suppressed materials, testimony from multiple witnesses, and extensive documentation of systemic practices, this court finds overwhelming evidence of civil rights violations, abuse of power, and institutional corruption within the Redgate Police Department. A collective intake of breath filled the room. Some people reached for each other's hands. Others leaned forward in their seats. "Therefore, by the power vested in this court, I hereby order the immediate disbandment of the Redgate Police Department in its current form." Willow's voice remained steady, but carried an unmistakable weight of authority. "All senior staff members are to be placed under federal investigation. Their duties will be temporarily assumed by state law enforcement until a new community-based police force can be established." Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Several former officers in attendance shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Furthermore, this court orders the creation of a federal civil rights oversight commission, specifically tasked with monitoring and implementing urban policing reforms. This commission will have direct oversight of all new law enforcement initiatives in Redgate and similar communities. She turned a page, her movements deliberate. Regarding damages, this court orders substantial reparations to be paid to the families of all victims identified in this case, including the family of Langston James. Her voice wavered slightly at her brother's name, but she pressed on. The exact amounts will be detailed in the written ruling, with consideration given to both material and emotional damages suffered. Willow paused, then looked directly at Mark Harland. Additionally, this court moves to officially clear the record of former officer Mark Harland. Her voice softened without losing its authority. Mr. Harland stood alone when others chose to obey corrupt orders. He honored his badge by being willing to give it up. His actions on the night of October 14th, 18 years ago, represent the highest ideals of law enforcement, protecting the innocent at any cost. Mark's shoulders trembled slightly. A woman beside him squeezed his arm in support. "This ruling," Willow continued, "is not the end, but a beginning. It represents our commitment to confronting hard truths, to acknowledging historical wrongs, and to building a justice system worthy of its name." She placed both hands on the bench, leaning forward slightly. "Let the record show that the truth cannot be buried forever. Justice may be delayed, but it need not be denied." As she finished speaking, the courtroom erupted in applause. People rose to their feet, some crying, others embracing. The sound swelled until it filled every corner of the high-ceilinged room. Mark remained seated, his eyes closed. His chest rose and fell in deep, steady breaths, as if he could finally fill his lungs completely after 18 years of shallow breathing. A single tear traced down his weathered cheek. Willow picked up her gavel one last time. The sound of it striking the bench cut through the applause, bringing the room to order. With careful movements, she placed it down gently on the polished wood, a final act of authority transformed into a symbol of transition. As she stepped down from the bench, reporters surged forward, held back only by the bailiffs. Camera flashes lit up the room like lightning. Outside the courtroom doors, an even larger crowd of journalists waited. One reporter, a young woman with determined eyes, managed to catch Willow's attention as she moved through the crowd. "Judge James," she called out, "what made you pursue this case so personally?" Willow paused, turning to face the reporter. The cameras fell silent, waiting for her answer. Her response came without hesitation, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed corridor. Because the truth never dies. It just waits to be heard. 6 months after the landmark ruling, Redgate hummed with the sounds of change. The rhythmic pounding of construction equipment filled the morning air as workers transformed the corner where the old police precinct once stood. The skeletal framework of the Harlan Center for Justice, youth empowerment, rose against the blue sky, its foundations deep and solid. Workers in hard hats carefully maneuvered a temporary sign into place. The bold letters caught the sunlight. "Future home of the Harlan Center, building justice together." A group of kids on bikes slowed as they passed, their young faces full of curiosity. One boy balanced on his pedals, neck craned back to take in the full height of the structure. "My sister says they're going to teach kids about their rights here," one girl said, her braids swinging as she turned to her friends. "My mom's already signed up to volunteer," another child added proudly. The construction supervisor waved at the children, and they waved back before pedaling away, their laughter mixing with the sounds of progress. Inside the temporary community space across the street, Mark Harlan stood before a group of 15 formerly incarcerated young men and women. The room was simple but welcoming, with chairs arranged in a circle and sunlight streaming through tall windows. On the walls hung posters about conflict resolution and community empowerment. "The key to de-escalation," Mark explained, his voice carrying the quiet authority of experience, "is recognizing that every person needs to feel heard." His shoulder still carried the old injury, but he moved with purpose now, the weight of shame finally lifted from his stance. A young man raised his hand. "But what if they're already aggressive? What if they're not listening?" Mark nodded, acknowledging the challenge. "Let me share a real situation I encountered." He went on to describe a tense standoff he'd witnessed, breaking down the body language, tone, and specific words that had turned potential violence into dialogue. The students leaned forward, taking notes. Many of them had lived through similar situations from the other side. Now they were learning to be bridges instead of barriers. "Remember," Mark continued, "your presence alone can change the energy of a situation. You don't need a badge to be a peacekeeper." Upstairs, in a brightly lit classroom, Judge Willow James stood before a different kind of gathering. Law students and business casuals sat alongside teenagers in hoodies and jeans, all equally engaged as she moved through her presentation. "The body camera footage request form looks intimidating," Willow said, clicking to the next slide. "But don't let that stop you. Here's where you start." She guided them through the process, pointing out common pitfalls and sharing shortcuts she'd learned through years of experience. A teenage girl in the front row raised her hand. "What if they say the footage was lost?" Willow's lips curved in a knowing smile. "That's when you file this," she said, pulling up another document. "It's called a preservation order. Always request it first, before they have a chance to lose anything." She moved through the workshop with practiced ease, breaking down complex legal concepts into accessible steps. The students took photos of her slides with their phones, asked questions without hesitation. The atmosphere was focused but relaxed, a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined interactions between Redgate's youth and authority figures. As both sessions ended, Mark and Willow met in the hallway between classrooms. Their students filtered out around them, many stopping to thank them or ask final questions. "How's the de-escalation class going?" Willow asked, gathering her materials. Mark's eyes crinkled with genuine warmth. "They're naturals. Most of them already know what works. They just needed someone to confirm it." "Same with my group," Willow replied. "They understand the system better than most lawyers I know. They just needed the tools to work within it." They paused by a framed newspaper article on the wall. The headline stood out in bold type. Harlan cleared. James dismantles Redgate PD. Below it was a photo of them both outside the courthouse, captured in a moment of shared victory. Later that evening, they sat in a corner booth at Marie's Diner, a local establishment that had served Redgate families for generations. The vinyl seats were worn but clean, and the smell of home cooking filled the air. Willow's mother sat across from them, her presence adding a gentle warmth to the gathering. The waitress brought their usual orders: meatloaf for Mark, grilled chicken for Willow, and sweet potato pie for her mother. The conversation flowed easily, punctuated by the soft clink of silverware and the distant murmur of other diners. "The center's really coming along," Willow's mother observed, stirring her coffee. "Langston would have loved seeing those kids on their bikes out front today." Mark nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's starting to feel real now, not just a building, but what it represents." Willow reached into her bag and pulled out a wrapped package, sliding it across the table to Mark. "Speaking of making things real," Mark carefully unwrapped the gift, revealing a hardbound book. The cover was simple but striking. "The Badge I Gave Back," by Mark Harland. His fingers traced the embossed letters. "First printed copy," Willow said softly. "Hot off the press." Mark shook his head, a mix of disbelief and humility crossing his features. "Still don't think anyone will read it." Willow's mother reached across the table, patting his hand with maternal affection. Her smile held years of wisdom as she replied, "They already are." The diner's lights cast a warm glow over their table, and through the window, the sunset painted Redgate's changing skyline in shades of hope. 1 year after the landmark ruling that changed Redgate forever, the morning sun cast long shadows across the newly completed Harlan Center for Justice, a Youth Empowerment. The building stood as a testament to transformation, its modern architecture somehow both bold and welcoming, with floor-to-ceiling windows that invited light and transparency. Vibrant murals decorated the exterior walls, each one telling a story of community, resilience, and hope. A diverse crowd had gathered for the grand opening ceremony, filling the plaza in front of the center. Local families stood shoulder to shoulder with community leaders. Federal observers in suits mingled with teenagers in bright hoodies, and elderly residents who'd witnessed decades of Redgate's history sat in chairs, arranged near the front. Children lined up eagerly at the glass doors, pressing their faces against the windows to peek inside at the colorful interior. The center's lobby featured interactive displays, computer stations, and reading nooks designed to make learning about justice feel accessible and engaging. "Look at the library," one young girl exclaimed, pointing at the visible row of books through the window. "They've got graphic novels too." The ceremony began with local leaders taking turns at the podium. Pastor Johnson, who'd led prayers during the darkest days of Redgate's past, spoke about healing. Ms. Rodriguez, who'd run the original community center, shared stories of resilience. Even Officer Cole, now working with the new community-led public safety initiative, talked about the importance of trust and accountability. Federal observers sat in a reserved section, taking notes and nodding approvingly. Their presence marked how far things had come, from oversight born of mistrust to partnership built on progress. Mayor Chen, elected in the wake of Denver's downfall, stepped up to the microphone. "This center represents more than just a building," she declared, her voice carrying across the plaza. "It represents a promise to our children that their rights matter, that their voices count, and that justice isn't just a word in a textbook, it's something they can help shape." The crowd applauded warmly as Judge Willow James rose from her seat and approached the podium. She wore a simple blue dress rather than her judicial robes, making it clear she stood before them not as a federal judge, but as someone whose roots ran deep in Redgate soil. Willow paused, her hands resting lightly on the podium as she surveyed the gathered faces. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of lived experience and the lightness of hard-won hope. 18 years ago, I sat under a table in a community center not unlike this one, she began. I was 8 years old drawing pictures with crayons when chaos erupted around me. In that moment of terror, something extraordinary happened, something that would shape not just my life, but the future of this community. She gestured to where Mark sat quietly in the front row, his presence as steady and humble as ever. A police officer named Mark Harlan made a choice that night. He saw past the badges and bulletproof vests, past the orders and operations, and recognized something simple but profound. I was just a child with a crayon. When another officer's gun raised, Mark didn't hesitate. He jumped between us, taking a bullet that was meant for me. The crowd listened in respectful silence, many having heard pieces of this story but never the whole truth from Willow herself. But this center, she continued, her voice growing stronger, doesn't honor a hero. It honors the choice to be one when no one's looking, when it costs you everything, when doing right means standing alone. That's the lesson I learned that night, the lesson that carried me through law school, onto the bench, and back here to Redgate. She turned slightly, nodding to someone off stage. A large cloth covering the center's main wall began to lower. This center exists to remind us that justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we create together, every day, through countless small choices and occasional big ones. The cloth fell away completely, revealing a stunning mural that drew gasps from the crowd. The artwork showed Mark kneeling, extending a book to a small girl whose painted wings seemed to shimmer in the sunlight streaming through the windows. Behind them, a scale of justice hung in perfect balance, its pans filled not with weights but with books, paintbrushes, and tools of learning and change. Above the image, elegant letters spelled out, "He didn't save her life. He showed her how to save her own." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Some wiped away tears. Children pointed excitedly at different elements of the mural, already beginning to ask questions about its meaning. As the ceremony concluded, and people began filing into the center for tours, the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in deep oranges and purples. Inside, past the bustling lobby where families explored the new facilities, Willow walked quietly down a corridor. She found Mark sitting alone on a bench near a window, watching children play on the newly installed playground equipment outside. The sounds of laughter and excitement echoed through the halls behind them as Willow took a seat beside him. For a long moment, they sat in comfortable silence, both taking in the scene before them, children from all backgrounds playing together, parents chatting on nearby benches, teenagers helping younger kids navigate the climbing structure. Finally, Willow turned to him with a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Think they'll listen to an old ex-cop with no pension?" Mark's eyes crinkled with warmth as he watched a young boy help his little sister up the slide. "Only if you keep reminding them I took a bullet for the judge." They sat together, witnesses to the change they'd helped create, as the sounds of life and hope continued to fill the halls of the center behind them. If you enjoyed the story of Mark and Willow, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.